Struggling nurse donates blood to an emergency patient, only to learn he's a CEO. Single dad who comes back with a life-changing proposal. "Where's Carter? I need her now!" The sharp command cracked through the chaos of the emergency room like thunder, nearly drowning out the real thing outside. Rain pounded the windows in relentless sheets, the storm turning the night into a mess of howling wind and flashing lights. "I'm here." Nancy Carter's voice rose over the noise as she rushed around the corner, wiping her damp hands on her scrubs. Her blonde hair was tied back in a bun that had loosened over the course of her shift, soft strands falling around her face. Her blue eyes, rimmed with fatigue, still held a calm, unwavering light. Dr. Harris turned toward her, his brows furrowed beneath his rain-speckled glasses. "Trauma 1, male, mid-40s, massive internal bleeding from a car crash on the I-70. Blood type AB negative. We've got nothing in the bank." Nancy didn't hesitate. "I'm AB negative." "You just pulled a 36-hour shift. You can barely stand." "He might not live to see morning," she replied, already stepping toward the trauma bay. "I'll be fine." Dr. Harris paused, then nodded. "Prep her for draw, now." Inside Trauma 1, the scene was grim. The man on the stretcher was unconscious, skin ghostly pale against the blood-soaked sheets. Monitors beeped in warning tones as nurses swarmed around him. Rain dripped from the edge of the stretcher where the paramedics had wheeled him in without pause. His suit jacket had been cut open, revealing a crisp white shirt now darkened with blood. Nancy's eyes locked on the man's face as she sat down beside him, extending her arm. Strong jaw, high cheekbones, a faint scar beneath his chin. Even in this state there was something composed about him, as if the chaos around him had no claim. She looked away only when the nurse tapped her arm, tying the band and preparing the draw. "Here we go," the nurse said gently. "You sure about this?" Nancy nodded. "Let's do it." The needle slid in. She barely flinched. Minutes passed like hours. The room was all motion, compressions, suction, commands shouted and obeyed. But Nancy sat still, watching the man's chest rise and fall beneath the oxygen mask. His breaths were shallow. His face, despite its calm, told a story she couldn't yet read, years of weight carried silently. Her vision blurred slightly, her head light from the donation. She pressed her free hand to the edge of the gurney to steady herself. Across the bed, Harris glanced at her, concern flashing in his eyes. "You holding up?" he asked. "I'm okay," she said softly. But the truth was, her body was screaming for rest. Her legs ached, her arms tingled. Every nerve felt like it was moving underwater. Still, she kept her gaze on the man's face. There was something about him. She didn't know his name. She didn't know where he had been going when his car flipped off the interstate, or why the paramedics looked at each other with something close to reverence when they loaded him in. But she knew one thing. She didn't want him to die. A nurse stepped beside her. "We've got enough. You can rest now." Nancy nodded slowly, letting them remove the needle. As the flow of her blood stopped, she leaned back against the chair. Her eyes, heavy as stone, remained fixed on the stranger's face. The machine stabilized. Barely. Dr. Harris let out a breath. "We might have bought him time." As they wheeled him toward surgery, Nancy sat alone for a moment, listening to the echo of retreating footsteps. The rain outside had softened into a gentle patter, like the world exhaling. She glanced down at the bandage on her arm, then over at the tray where a blood bag, full and warm, lay ready. She looked again at the man's face as the stretcher disappeared around the corner. Something about that moment settled in her bones, a quiet certainty, deep and strange. She did not know yet that this man was Albert Blake, that he was one of the most powerful COs in the country, that he had a son, that he was alone. She only knew one thing: she had saved his life. And somehow, in a way she could not explain, he had just changed hers. Albert Blake opened his eyes to the soft hum of a heart monitor and the sterile scent of disinfectant. Dim light filtered through the closed blinds, casting horizontal shadows across the hospital room. His vision cleared slowly, the ceiling tiles sharp and unfamiliar. There were no flowers, no balloons, no family waiting at the bedside, only silence. He blinked once, then turned his head slightly, wincing as pain lanced through his side. He looked down. His torso was tightly wrapped. An IV line snaked into his arm. On the table beside the bed sat a plain glass of water and a folded blanket. A nurse entered, clipboard in hand. "You're awake," she said with a smile. "We'll run some scans shortly. You're stable now." Albert didn't respond. His dark eyes took her in, assessing, distant. She paused, waiting for a word, even a nod. Nothing. 3 days passed. No visitors, no conversations. Just the sound of rain, the buzz of machines, and Albert's unreadable expression. On the 4th morning, before the sun rose, he discharged himself. No grand gesture, no conversation with the staff. He simply signed the forms, dressed slowly, and walked out into the fading night, his tailored coat draped over his arm, his pace steady, his presence almost invisible. No one saw the man who'd saved 1,000 jobs, negotiated billion-dollar deals, or who carried a grief deeper than bone. Nancy Carter found out later during a shift change. "He left?" she asked the charge nurse, trying not to let her voice reveal the quiet disappointment blooming in her chest. The nurse shrugged. "Just walked out." Not a word. Nancy stood in the hallway for a moment, biting the inside of her cheek. She didn't expect thanks. That was never why she did what she did. But something about this one, it lingered. Maybe it was the silence. She turned back to her station, sighing as she checked the next room. Inside, Mr. Langley, an elderly veteran with a biting tongue and a broken hip, sat grumbling at the edge of his bed. "I told you people I don't want your lousy pudding or your fake compassion," he barked as she walked in. Nancy smiled gently. "Good morning to you too, Mr. Langley." "You're too young to understand pain," he muttered. She sat beside him, taking a cloth from the tray. "I think pain doesn't care about age." He snorted, but didn't pull away as she gently began cleaning the wound on his arm. Her hands trembled slightly, exhaustion still clinging to her, but her touch remained careful, patient. "I don't want the TV," he grumbled after a moment. "But maybe some music." Nancy tapped her phone and searched through her playlist. She found an old piano piece, Chopin, soft and familiar. As the notes filled the room, the harshness in Mr. Langley's features softened, if only slightly. "You play this?" he asked, eyes narrowing. "Used to," she replied, still dabbing the wound. "A long time ago." Outside the room, unseen, Albert Blake stood quietly at the end of the hall. He hadn't planned to return, but something had pulled him back. He watched Nancy through the window, the way her tired eyes still lit up for a patient, the way she steadied her hand when it wanted to tremble, the way her presence made even the most bitter man listen to music. He didn't know her name, not yet, but he recognized what he saw, a kind of strength wrapped in gentleness, foreign to the cold world he knew. Albert turned and walked away before she could see him. That evening, after her shift, Nancy returned to the nurse's station to find a small, folded note on her desk. There was no name, just a short message in neat, deliberate handwriting. "You gave something you did not have to give. I will not forget it. A grateful stranger." She stared at the words for a long time, then slowly smiled. She didn't know that the man who wrote it was the one she had saved, didn't know he'd watched her, didn't know he was about to become the most unexpected chapter of her life. It was Sunday morning, and for the first time in weeks, Nancy Carter allowed herself a slow walk beneath the golden canopy of trees at Riverview Park. The storm had passed, leaving behind the crisp clarity of early fall. Leaves crunched underfoot as children's laughter rang from the nearby playground. She needed this. A little silence, a little space to breathe. Passing a line of park benches, she spotted a boy, alone, kneeling on the sidewalk just ahead. He looked no more than 7 or 8, dark-haired and slim, his back to her. Something in his posture caught her attention. He was drawing on the pavement with sidewalk chalk. Spirals, symbols, shapes. Not random, childish doodles, but intricate patterns. Detailed, repetitive, almost like… Nancy paused, her nurse's instinct whispering that something wasn't right. The boy suddenly dropped his chalk and froze. His breathing grew fast, erratic. His fingers curled into fists. His body began to rock. A few people nearby glanced his way, but didn't approach. Nancy knelt down a few feet behind him, careful not to touch. "Hey there," she said softly. "I really like your drawings." The boy didn't look up. His rocking intensified. "It's okay," she continued gently. "You're not in trouble. I just want to make sure you're all right." Still no response. But his hands loosened slightly. "I used to draw all the time with my little sister," she added. "She would have loved your colors." The boy turned his head slightly, just enough for her to see his eyes, wide, overwhelmed, but listening. Nancy slowly sat beside him, careful to keep a bit of space. She picked up a spare piece of chalk nearby and, without a word, began drawing a circle next to his last spiral. Then another and another. The boy stared. He picked up his chalk again, drew a line that connected their shapes. They sat like that for a few minutes, wordless but joined. It was then that Nancy noticed the tag on the boy's jacket. Caleb. "Is your name Caleb?" she asked. He nodded once. "Are you here with someone?" His lips parted, but no sound came. He pointed vaguely toward the woods behind the playground. "Did you get separated?" Another nod. His hands began to twitch again, panic flickering across his face. Before Nancy could speak, a voice, hoarse, desperate, cut through the park. "Caleb!" A man emerged from the trees, sprinting across the grass. Tall, broad-shouldered. His shirt clung to him with sweat, and worry etched every line of his face. He dropped to his knees as soon as he reached the boy, wrapping his arms tightly around him. "Oh, thank God," he whispered. "I'm so sorry, buddy. I turned around for 1 second and…" His voice cracked. "I thought I lost you." Nancy stood back, giving them space. Her eyes moved to the man's face and froze. It was him, the man from the ER, Albert Blake. But this time, no machines, no monitors. Just a father holding his son like the world depended on it. His eyes lifted and met hers. For a long moment, neither spoke. Nancy didn't say anything. She didn't ask why he had left the hospital without a word, or why he looked like someone who carried the weight of too many silent battles. She only smiled softly and knelt beside Caleb again. "He's all right," she said gently. "Just overwhelmed. He's incredibly bright." Albert blinked, still catching his breath. He does not talk to strangers." Nancy glanced at Caleb, who was now holding tightly to his father's coat. "He didn't have to," she said. "We drew instead." Albert looked down and noticed the chalk pattern surrounding them. He exhaled slowly, his features softening for the first time. "I'm sorry," he said at last, his voice low. "Thank you for staying with him." Nancy stood, brushing chalk dust from her hands. Any parent would have done the same. "No," Albert replied quietly. "They wouldn't have." Their eyes met again, this time longer. Nancy gave Caleb a small wave. "Take care, little artist." Then she turned to go, not waiting for anything more. Albert watched her retreat, his heart still racing. He had come to the park that morning hoping for a quiet walk with his son. Instead, he had run headlong into the woman who had saved his life, and somehow, in just minutes, she had calmed the storm in his son, too. 2 days after the encounter at the park, Nancy Carter was back at the hospital, finishing up paperwork, when her name came through the intercom. "Nurse Carter, you have a visitor in the main lobby." She glanced at the clock. Nearly 8 p.m. Curious and a bit hesitant, she walked down the corridor, pulling off her gloves as she went. In the lobby, standing by the large windows, with rain cascading behind him, was Albert Blake. He wasn't in a hospital gown this time. He wore a tailored navy coat, sleek slacks, polished shoes. His presence was sharp and composed, quiet authority wrapped in stillness. "Mr. Blake," she said, approaching slowly. He turned, meeting her eyes with the same unreadable calm. but this time something warmer flickered beneath it. "Please, call me Albert." Nancy nodded once. "What brings you here?" "I wanted to thank you properly," he said, then paused, "and ask you for something more." She tilted her head. "More?" He reached into his coat and handed her a business card, not a company one, but personal. "Tell my..." His name, his number, and address. "My son Caleb, he trusts you." "That's rare," he hesitated. "I've been looking for a private caregiver, not just medically trained, but someone patient, someone who sees him." Nancy blinked, surprised. "You want me to work for you?" "I want you to help him," Albert replied. "He's bright, kind, but the world moves too fast, too loud. He needs someone who can move at his pace. You did that without trying." Nancy looked down at the card. "It's a lot to ask." "I know," he said. "I'm offering full salary, flexibility, housing on site if you prefer, whatever makes it possible." She glanced up. "Housing?" Albert gave a small nod. "We live in Fairwood. It's quiet. You'd have your own space." Nancy considered it. She had grown used to solitude, her tiny apartment, her routines, but when she thought of Caleb's wide eyes, his chalk drawings, his gentle silence, something tugged at her. "I'll come," she said quietly, "but only because he needs someone." Albert's lips curved into the faintest smile. "I thought you might say that." Fairwood Estate was nothing like she expected. It wasn't a cold mansion or a sterile fortress. It was warm, understated, surrounded by trees, a wide porch, sun-faded stone, tall windows filled with books and light. Nancy moved in that weekend. At first, everything was formal. Albert kept his distance, polite but measured. But Caleb greeted her with his box of chalk and a quiet tug on her sleeve. That was enough. They fell into rhythm. Mornings began with walks in the garden, afternoons with quiet drawing or music therapy. Evenings, Caleb sat beside her as she read aloud or helped him with word puzzles. Albert often lingered nearby, watching from doorways, listening without interrupting. One evening, Nancy found herself in the kitchen, fumbling through a cabinet. "You're out of Earl Grey," she muttered aloud. Without a word, Albert appeared at the doorway, handed her a steaming cup. She took a sip. It was perfect, 2 sugars, no milk, exactly how she liked it. "You remembered?" she asked, surprised. Albert shrugged, a small smile tugging at his lips. "I noticed things." Later that week, Nancy discovered the estate's library. It was beautiful, floor-to-ceiling shelves, a velvet reading chair, and in the corner a black baby grand piano, dusty from disuse. One quiet night when the house was still, she sat down and lifted the lid. Her fingers trembled at first. Then the notes came. Soft, hesitant, then flowing. It was the melody she used to play for her sister, gentle and sorrowful, like a memory wrapped in light. Outside the door, Albert stood in the hallway, hidden in shadow. He didn't move, didn't speak. He just listened, hand resting lightly against the frame. The music said more than words ever could, and for the first time in years, the house felt like a home. The first headline appeared on a Wednesday morning. From street musician to private nurse, the mysterious past of Albert Blake's caregiver. Nancy was folding Caleb's laundry when she saw the article on the kitchen tablet. Her hands stopped mid-fold. The picture, blurry, taken from years ago, showed her sitting on a city sidewalk with a young girl beside her, a battered piano keyboard between them. Her heart dropped. By the afternoon, 2 more articles had surfaced. One delved into the accident that had claimed her sister's life. The other questioned her credentials, twisting her years of struggle into something almost sinister. They made it sound like she had something to hide, like she had failed. Nancy sat on the porch in silence as the wind stirred the trees. She knew this moment would come. She just didn't expect it to hurt this much. She thought of Caleb, of his chalk drawings and gentle eyes, thought of Albert, the way he listened to her play, the way he noticed even the smallest details. She thought of the quiet joy that had started to bloom in the corners of her life, and she thought of losing it. It started with a tense call from the hospital board, then a formal letter, then whispers among staff who once admired her. Why didn't she disclose her past? Street performer? Is that even legal? Does Mr. Blake know? She did not wait for the scandal to reach his doorstep. That night, rain lashed the windows like broken glass. Nancy stood in her room at Fairwood, her suitcase half-packed. She had placed her music books in first, then her sketch pad, then her few keepsakes. The piano, of course, she would leave, but the small wooden box with her sister's name carved on top, she clutched that in her arms like it still held breath and laughter. She moved to the front hallway quietly, careful not to wake Caleb. Her coat soaked quickly as she stepped outside, but she didn't stop. She moved to the car, waiting by the edge of the drive. Behind her, a voice called out through the storm. "Nancy!" She froze. Albert stood at the door, rain washing down his face like tears the sky could not hold. "You were going to leave without saying goodbye?" he asked, stepping forward. Her lips trembled. "It's all over the news, Albert. I didn't want Caleb dragged into it." "I don't care about the news," he said, voice breaking. "I care about the truth." Nancy looked away. "The truth is, we were poor. I played on sidewalks to put us both through school. One night after a performance, a drunk driver—" She swallowed hard. "I was 15 feet away. I heard the crash. I couldn't reach her in time." She blinked, fighting the tears. "That's why I stopped playing. Every note reminded me of her." Albert stared at her, the rain soaking his clothes, his hair, but he didn't move. I'm sorry," she said, barely audible. "But if I stay, people will use it against you. Against Caleb." Albert stepped closer, his voice raw. "Do you think I care what the world says about me? I've been called worse than reckless for hiring a nurse with a heart." Nancy's fingers tightened on the handle of her suitcase. "You don't understand," she whispered. "You and Caleb, this place, it gave me peace. But I won't be the reason people come after you." She turned to go. Albert's voice cracked behind her. "I let someone walk away once. Caleb's mother. She couldn't handle who he was. She walked out and never looked back." His voice dropped to a whisper. "I didn't stop her. The rain fell harder. But this time, I won't make that mistake again." Nancy turned, her eyes shining with tears. Albert's were already breaking. "I should have told you," she said. "You should have stayed," he replied. They stood in the storm, neither moving, wind whipping, hearts trembling. Then Nancy stepped forward and pressed the suitcase into his hands. "I need time," she said softly, "but I'll come back." Albert didn't answer. He only nodded once and held the suitcase like it carried more than belongings and carried her promise. The boardroom was packed, the air thick with tension. Wall-length windows framed a flawless city skyline, and at the head of the long table, Albert Blake's chair sat empty, for the first time in over a decade. "Where the hell is he?" one executive muttered. "We're down 2 points after this scandal broke. If he doesn't show, he's never missed a quarterly call." "And now he does? Because of a nurse?" Across the room, his assistant calmly closed her tablet. "He won't be attending," she said, rising to leave. He had another engagement. Across the city, in a modest community center that still smelled faintly of fresh paint and wood glue, folding chairs filled a small hall. Paper lanterns hung from the ceiling. Children giggled in corners, volunteers handed out hot cocoa, and a simple, hand-painted banner read, "Music for the Heart Benefit Concert for Homeless Youth." Backstage, Nancy Carter sat at a worn, upright piano, her fingers resting gently on the keys. She took a breath, held it, then let it out slowly. This was her first public performance in years. She had no elegant gown, no concert hall. Just her sister's charm bracelet around her wrist, and her heart beating louder than the crowd beyond the curtain. She whispered under her breath, "This is for you, Lily." Then she played. Soft, uncertain at first, like a voice rediscovering itself. Then, stronger, more sure. The melody was something she had written years ago, back when dreams still felt safe. a piece about beginnings and endings, about light returning after rain. The audience fell silent, even the children. In the very back of the room, unnoticed, Albert stood alone in a charcoal coat, his eyes fixed on her through the crowd. He had arrived just as she touched the first note, slipping into the room without a word. He had stood in boardrooms with billionaires, in front of cameras, on magazine covers, but never had he felt the pull in his chest like this. Watching her now, her eyes closed, the music flowing from her as if it had waited its whole life to be heard, he saw the truth. This was what mattered. Not the press releases, not the market shares, not the whispered judgments of people who'd never fought for anything but their own comfort. Nancy's music wasn't just beautiful, it was brave. His vision blurred. He didn't wipe his eyes. He just listened and made his choice. After the concert, Nancy sat on the edge of the small stage, sipping lukewarm cocoa and thanking volunteers. Her fingers still tingled, half in disbelief. "Miss Carter?" A boy's voice called. She looked up and smiled as the little girl ran up to hug her knees. "That was magic," Nancy laughed, brushing hair out of the girl's eyes. "Thank you, sweetie." Then she saw him, standing at the back of the room, still, silent. Her heart stopped. Albert. He didn't walk toward her immediately. Instead, he waited, as if unsure whether he was allowed in her light again. Nancy rose slowly. They met halfway between the crowd and the shadows. "You weren't at the press conference," she said gently. "No," he replied. "I was here." "Your board won't like that," he shrugged. "They've survived worse." A pause. "I had a speech prepared," he continued. "Something polished, strategic. But I watched you play and—" He looked down. "I realized I don't want to live in a world that tells you not to be who you are." Nancy's breath caught. "You don't have to fix me, Albert." "I know," he said. "I just want to stand beside you." She looked at him then, not as her former patient, not as Caleb's father, but as a man who had finally seen what really mattered. "I'm not the same girl who used to play on the streets," she whispered. "No," he agreed. "You're stronger, and so am I." In the quiet of the hall, still echoing with the last notes of her music, their hands found each other. Not in grand declarations, but in quiet truth. The small local theater was filled to capacity, though it seated less than 200. A soft golden light warmed the walls, and the scent of freshly polished wood and wildflowers lingered in the air. A hand-lettered program sat on every seat. Nancy Carter, A Night of Healing Through Music, backstage. Nancy stood in front of a full-length mirror, smoothing the skirt of her navy blue dress. Her hair was pulled back softly, just enough to keep it out of her eyes. Around her wrist, her sister's charm bracelet. She closed her eyes and breathed. This was the first formal concert she had agreed to in almost a decade. No street corner, no hospital hallway. A real stage, a real audience, and a song that had waited in silence far too long. Her fingers trembled slightly as she stepped out beneath the spotlight. The applause welcomed her, but she barely heard it. She sat at the grand piano like it was a childhood friend. Then, without introduction, she began to play. It was Lily's favorite, a quiet melody, gentle as breath, notes that rose and fell like waves against memory. In the stillness of the theater, time bent, folding the past and the present together. Every note was a conversation, every pause a moment of sorrow and hope. By the time she reached the final chords, the entire room was silent. No coughs, no shuffling, only hearts listening. Nancy held the last note longer than written, letting it linger in the air like a goodbye and a beginning at once. Then she stood, bowed softly, and stepped into the shadows of the wings. But just before the curtain could fall, the house lights came up, and there, in the center aisle, stood Albert Blake, dressed simply in black, his expression calm but full. In his hand he held something small. At his side stood Caleb, his tiny fingers gripping his father's tightly. Nancy blinked, confused for a moment, until she saw Caleb begin to walk forward, slowly, carefully, toward her. She met them at the edge of the stage, stepping down the few steps in silence, her heart already racing. Caleb reached out his hand and opened it. Inside was a ring. Simple, elegant, a silver band with a tiny sapphire, the color of her eyes. Nancy looked up at Albert, tears stinging. He didn't kneel, he didn't speak. He just placed his hand over Caleb's gently and nodded. Everything was said in that gesture, in the trust, in the humility, in the love. Nancy knelt beside the boy, tears slipping down her cheeks. "Did you help him choose this?" she whispered. Caleb nodded, then whispered back, "Blue, like the chalk?" Nancy smiled through the tears. She stood, looked at Albert, and reached for his hand. "Yes," she said simply. No fanfare, no need for anything more. The theater erupted into applause, not for the music this time, but for the quiet, powerful union that had formed through blood, healing, and a symphony of hearts finding their way home. "Yes." The word barely left Nancy's lips before she was pulled into a hug, small arms wrapping tightly around her waist. "Caleb." He clung to her with a suddenness and strength that made her heart burst, and then, in the softest voice, trembling but certain, he whispered against her side, "I love you." Nancy froze. Tears welled instantly, flooding her vision. Slowly she bent down and cupped his face, nodding through the tears. "I love you too," she whispered. Albert stepped beside them, his eyes shining. Without a word, he placed a hand on both their shoulders. That one touch said everything. We're a family now, 1 year later. The old church building on Oak Street had been transformed. The pews were gone, replaced by bright rugs, shelves of instruments, and sunlight pouring through stained glass windows. At the front of the room, a chalkboard read, "Nancy Carter's School of Music and Expression, for every child, every heart." Children of all kinds filled the space, some in wheelchairs, some nonverbal, others simply quiet and curious. All were welcome. Nancy walked through the room with grace and joy, helping a boy with sensory headphones adjust his violin. A girl tapped out notes on a keyboard nearby, beaming with pride. In one corner, Caleb sat cross-legged, showing a new student how to use colored chalk to draw music on the floor. He had blossomed, no longer just surviving the world, but reaching into it, offering pieces of himself. Albert sat near the back, helping organize donations for the next community drive. His suit days were long behind him. He wore jeans and a faded t-shirt, his sleeves rolled up, laugh lines deeper, voice lighter. He had resigned from the CEO position 6 months ago. He never looked back. Now he served on nonprofit boards, fundraised for underprivileged families, and poured his time into causes that mattered, not for profit, but for purpose. And every day he returned to this place, to Nancy, to Caleb, to their new rhythm of life. That evening, the sun dipped low over the hills, casting golden light through the window of their living room. In the corner sat an old upright piano, rescued from a school auction, slightly out of tune but perfect. Nancy sat at the keys. Albert rested on the couch, Caleb beside him with a sketchbook in hand, humming along to the melody Nancy played. Her fingers danced, not with sorrow anymore, but with peace, with joy, with freedom. As the final notes settled into the room like a blessing, Albert crossed the room, leaned down and kissed the top of her head. "Dinner can wait," he murmured. "Play another." She looked up at him, smiling. "Only if you two sing this time," Caleb giggled, shaking his head. Albert gave a dramatic sigh. "Fine, but you'll regret it when I ruin your perfect harmonies." Nancy laughed, light and true. In that small, sun-drenched room, 3 hearts beat in quiet harmony. A man once drowning in silence, a woman once haunted by music, and a boy who had never spoken the words until love made him brave. They had all been saved, not by blood, but by compassion, by understanding, by love. And, in the end, that was the only music that truly mattered. If this story touched your heart the way it touched ours, take a moment to reflect on the quiet heroes among us, those who give even when they have little left, those who heal not with grand gestures but with patience, kindness, and love. Nancy and Albert's journey wasn't just about saving lives, it was about saving each other. And sometimes, the most life-changing moments come in silence, in sacrifice, and in the courage to begin again. If you believe in the power of love, of second chances, and of music that heals the soul, please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Soul-Stirring Stories. Because here, we tell stories that don't just entertain, they heal. Thank you for watching. We'll see you in the next story.